Welcome. I know people are joining. We'll start in just a minute. All right, I think we're going to get started. I want to welcome everyone who's joining today, and I know some folks are still trickling in, but I want to kick us off for this great session we're going to have together today, which is our webinar on the report More Than CAFOs and Corn, a statistical analysis of agriculture in 6 Midwestern states. So I'm Emily Leib, and I'm a clinical professor at Harvard Law School and director of the Center for Health Law and Policy Innovation and the Food Law and Policy Clinic. And I'm really excited to, in a moment, introduce our two speakers and let them take it away. We're going to hear today about a report that our speakers today have worked on over the past year that's really a very comprehensive analysis of farm production, farmer race and ethnicity, and farm practices in 6 states in the Midwest. And it is really based on the most detailed set of data I've seen, kind of on an analysis of some data coming from the USDA, including the Census of Agriculture and the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, but really going in deep on the data that's out there and some of the history, why agriculture looks the way it does in those states. So I'm excited to hear from them. We're going to hear a little bit more about the report and some of the key findings, and also how to use this resource. And then we'll have time for questions. So I'm hoping that we'll have a good conversation with those who are joining us. So I'm just going to take a minute to introduce our speakers and turn it to them to kick us off. And then I'll be coming back to kind of moderate some Q&A. So please, at any point, whenever you have questions, use the Q&A function at the bottom to include them. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. We have Bryce Wilson Stucki, who is an independent researcher in the Washington, D.C. area. He has a background in data analysis and journalism and has published many news articles, including a 2021 report on USDA's Civil Rights Office that won an award for investigative journalism from the National Association of Black Journalists. Welcome, Bryce. And our other speaker today is Than Rosenberg, who is a visiting scholar with us here at the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic. He's also a very treasured alum of the law school and of the clinic. And his research as a visiting scholar focuses on the agricultural economy and the environment. And in addition to his academic work, he's published news articles in the New Republic, Mother Jones, and elsewhere. And they've both done so much more. That's just, the basics on who they are. So I will now turn it over to Bryce and Than to get us started and talk through the report. Thank you so much again for being here, for everyone that's joining us online.
Thank you, Emily. And before I begin, I want to thank Emily and the Food Law and Policy Clinic for assisting us in producing this report and inviting us to present today. I also want to thank the McKnight Foundation for their support. More Than CAFOs and Corn, as Emily mentioned, provides a comprehensive analysis of the farm economy, farmer demographics, and the environmental effects of Midwestern agriculture. We hope it'll serve as a resource for advocates and researchers working in these areas. And our presentation today is going to provide an overview of the report with the goal of identifying some of the main themes and key findings. We'll also relate trends in the Midwest to national trends. As Emily mentioned, our report is very, very data focused. We made extensive use of USDA data, primarily the 2017 Census of Agriculture, which was the latest census at the time we wrote the report. We used many other data sources as well, including the decennial census data from IPUMS and data sets from the National Center for Farm Worker Health as examples. And we supplemented these quantitative sources with findings from USDA reports, policy and academic articles, and news reports. And before we go further, I want to provide a quick caveat and note about our definition of Midwest, or whenever we say Midwest throughout this webinar, I want to clarify that we're just referring to the 6 states of Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. Midwest is a contested term, but it historically referred to these 6 states plus Michigan. And given our time and resource constraints, we excluded the Great Plains states as well as Missouri and Michigan, which all have their unique characteristics deserving of greater study. With that caveat out of the way, onto the major sections of the report. So the report incorporates our statistical analysis into an analytical framework for understanding Midwestern agriculture. The basic idea is as follows. The region has long produced a limited number of products, principally corn, soy, hogs, cattle, and dairy, which have been increasingly produced on larger and more specialized farms. These farms have invested in labor-saving technologies that raise their profits, putting them in a strong position to expand at the expense of their competitors. Farmers tend to keep their farms within families, which has created a club that only the well-off and lucky can access. Since Midwest farmers have historically almost all been white, and since BIPOC farmers still face discrimination today, this helps explain why there are almost no BIPOC farmers in the region today. Furthermore, many of the practices that Midwestern farmers use have been historically destructive, such as CAFO manure management systems that emit significant amounts of greenhouse gases. Now we'll get to the main sections of the report. The introduction provides an overview of the Midwest farm system. The Midwest captured over a quarter of all farm receipts in the United States in 2021, producing 2/3 of hogs, half of all corn and soybeans, and a quarter of all milk in the country. Midwest farms also tend to be highly specialized. As an example, 90% of corn and soy comes from farms that mainly produce these products. Farm sales are also highly concentrated. Farms with at least $150,000 in gross cash farm income captured 90% of all sales in 2017. These farms are incredibly capital intensive. Moderate sales farms with a gross cash farm income between $150,000 and below $350,000 had median assets of over $1.5 million in every state in 2017. We have an in-depth section on the history of agriculture in the region, which I'm only going to briefly mention here, but I encourage you all to take the time to read it if you want to better understand the region's current dynamics. Many of the patterns today, such as an emphasis on capital-intensive and monoculture production, were already evident by the late 1800s. The next section of the report analyzes the Midwest's major farm industries. These industries are corn and soy, hogs, dairy, and cattle. Almost 90% of Midwest farm revenues comes from these products. Each of these industries, with some exception for cattle ranches, is dominated by large capital-intensive farms. Rather than discuss each industry, I'll use corn and soy as an example. These crops account for 90% of all crop sales in the Midwest. The region's corn farms are highly mechanized, using machines to plant seeds, spread fertilizers, and harvest. The owners of these machines can make serious money. Mid-sized corn farms in Illinois, gross cash farm income from $350,000 to $1 million, have a median net cash farm income of $270,000 and median farm assets of $3 million. Midwest farmers also raise a variety of products with smaller markets. These include sugar beets, potatoes, and a variety of other crops like tomatoes and cabbage. Animal farmers, meanwhile, raise animals such as turkeys and ducks. Production of these products also tends to be highly concentrated on industrialized operations. As an example, sugar beet farmers use massive harvester machines that pull up beets and deposit them into holding bins. Farmers raise ducks and turkeys in CAFO conditions. Only 2 Indiana companies produce 3/4 of the nation's ducks. Small farms still produce significant amounts of certain products, but it's important to understand the economic and demographic makeup of these farms. And this is the point where some of our findings might be a little more controversial or at least new to some of our listeners. Many of the so-called small farms in the census are not farms in any traditional sense. USDA generally refers to these farms as lifestyle and retirement farms. Lifestyle and retirement farms have much more wealth and higher household incomes than the median rural household in the Midwest. The paradigmatic lifestyle or retirement farm is a large exurban or rural property owned by a wealthy family that has no interest in farming as a vocation. And so this is an incredibly important point, which I'm going to expand on some here, and we can also discuss it in the Q&A if people are interested. But again, if you think, or if you ask someone what the typical small farmer looks like, they're often going to think of someone struggling to make a living from farming and to sell more farming products. When in reality, this is not to say that all small farmers fit this paradigm, but the typical small farmer in the data is a wealthy family that is not interested in farming as a vocation. So imagine a dentist with a couple of horses, or a small business owner with a sprawling rural property who's never been on a John Deere outside of maybe their riding lawnmower. And so-called small farmers, such as this dentist and small business owner, make up the majority of small farmers in the census of agriculture. And these lifestyle and retirement farms often produce nothing, but in the aggregate, they do produce notable amounts of oats, hay, and of course, horses. This brings us to an important point about USDA data. The department includes a huge number of farms with limited or even no production in the census. Again, there are a large number of farms even with no production in the census of agriculture. USDA includes any operation that has the potential to produce $1,000 of agricultural products, even if the operation produces nothing at all. So if you think about, you may not, your property, if any of you rent or own properties, may not have the capacity to produce $1,000 of agricultural products, but probably everyone watching knows someone that's not a farmer who has a property that has at least the potential to produce $1,000 in agricultural products. So we're talking about a significant number of people and properties here. And we estimate that 17% of Midwest farms had no sales in 2017. Furthermore, the $1,000 sales threshold is very low and hasn't been adjusted for inflation since 1974. When we do adjust it, the threshold becomes roughly $5,000 in 2017. And a full 39% of Midwest farms in the census were below this cutoff for the 2017 census. So farms with very few or no sales distort estimates of farmers and averages across farms. and this is incredibly important to remember whenever you see a fact, you see any kind of mention of average farm income or sales, take into account that it's including these properties with little to no sales, often and typically owned by wealthy families who are not trying to sell agricultural goods, or at least a substantial amount. And so for an example, if we remove the 39% of farms below the sales threshold adjusted for inflation, average farm income would increase by 2/3. USDA's inclusion of these farms often distorts both the public's and researchers' perception of production on small farms, counts of BIPOC farmers, average incomes, and many other important metrics. And as someone that works with these data and reads researchers and journalists' accounts quite often, they almost never take into account these lifestyle and retirement farms when producing data. But in this report, we wanted to do that, and we go into even greater detail as to why in the report. So throughout the report, we focused on farms with at least moderate farms. But I also want to emphasize that if you look closely at the wealth and income data, some farms with moderate sales are operated by wealthy landowners who could expand their operations if they wanted to, but in fact, apparently do not do so. So with that, I will turn the presentation over to Bryce.
Thanks, Nate. So the next section of the report is called Farmer Economic Conditions. This analyzes the economic situation of farmers across different types of production, whereas earlier in the report, we go through by type of production. As Nate mentioned, large farms dominate Midwest agriculture. Farms with at least moderate sales account for only 28% of farms in the census, but 92% of sales, so virtually all production. And these farms averaged almost $200,000 in net cash farm income in 2017. Large farms also tend to have higher profit rates, as this figure shows. They also receive disproportionate shares of government payments and crop insurance benefits. And these factors both contribute to consolidation. Although Midwest farming is industrialized, this doesn't mean it is corporatized. In fact, 84% of farms with at least moderate sales are family farms, where the operator or their relatives own the majority of the farm. There's a lot to say about this, and we could discuss it after the presentation. The Midwest also has a very high share of rented farmland, with 40 to 50% of land being rented out in Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. I suspect that a high share of landowners are also families, so to speak. About 48% of rented land is owned by individuals. Another 47% is owned by trusts, partnerships, or family corporations. And many of these entities could be owned by families. And this is another topic we could discuss after the presentation. So the next section of the report discusses BIPOC farmers. Midwest farmers were over 99% white historically, and they're still over 99% white today. Despite that, BIPOC farmers have played an important role in the region's farm system. Native Americans lived and farmed in the Midwest for hundreds of years before white settlers arrived. They farmed and they burned trees to create habitats hospitable to bison, which they hunted. Therefore, when white settlers encountered the Midwest plains cleared of trees, they were actually finding a activity or a landscape created by human activity. There were actually African Americans among the earliest settlers in the Midwest, and by 1860 there were almost 350 African American settlements in the region, and some of them were interracial. In the early 1900s, recruiters from the sugar beet industry hired Mexican laborers from South Texas to work on sugar beet farms and in factories. This established the Midwest stream of seasonal migrant labor from South Texas to the Midwest, and that's a pattern that still exists today. So BIPOC farmers, they not only make up a small share of total farmers, they've also had a lot of trouble breaking into commercial farming. And this is likely due to the history of discrimination, lack of access to capital, and ongoing discrimination. The figure on this slide shows the total share of farmers by sales category for selected reported race groups. As you look from left to right, the slower a line rises, the more success the group has had breaking into higher sales categories. This graph shows all non-white groups have had less success than whites, who are represented by the brown line, in achieving higher levels of sales. Hispanic farmers, the orange line, have had the most relative success. And I think this is an important fact that deserves future research. So BIPOC farmers still face various obstacles today, and we talk about them by group, but I only have time for one example now. We analyzed a special USDA study that provided data for 3 Midwest Native American reservations with at least 10,000 acres and farms. On these reservations, a little less than 1% of sales were captured by Native American farmers. This very low figure reflects the challenges Native Americans have faced as a result of dispossession, the complicated legal issues related to the way many of them own land, and ongoing discrimination. We also provide information on farm workers in the report. Farm workers work more hours than primary operators on farms with at least moderate sales, but they receive much lower pay. Adding to the problems farm workers face, Midwest farmers have expanded their use of the H-2A guest worker program in recent years. Many farm workers compare the H-2A program to slavery because employers can coerce workers with the threat of deportation. We also analyze environmental issues in the report, including greenhouse gas emissions and pollution. The Midwest is a high emissions region, and Iowa leads the country in agricultural emissions. The largest sources of emissions are soil management, enteric fermentation, and manure management. We analyze proxies for these emissions, like milk cow inventory for manure management, and found that large farms are responsible for far disproportionate amounts of emissions. Midwest farmers have also damaged the environment. Many farmers over-fertilize their fields or fail to prevent fertilizer runoff, which can pollute the water. One recent study found that various Midwest water systems, serving over 2.8 million people, registered dangerous levels of nitrate pollution at least once over a period of 8 years. Polluted water can be dangerous for people, especially children, to drink, use, or swim in. And although there are not many of them, some Midwest farmers are using alternative farm systems. As an example, there were about 5,000 farms using an agroforestry practice in 2017. Agroforestry systems are systems that incorporate trees into farm production. And if adopted nationwide, agroforestry systems have the potential to sequester the carbon equivalent of 1/3 of total US emissions each year. So to summarize the main ideas in the report, our analysis found that Midwest farms have increasingly focused on a handful of forms of production, which are increasingly concentrated on large farms. The resulting system is capital intensive and environmentally destructive. Almost all farmers in the region are and historically have been white. Since farmers tend to keep farms and land in their families, and because BIPOC farmers still face discrimination, almost all farmers today are still white. With this said, there are many BIPOC farmers and farmers using alternative systems who are fighting for change in the region. And we also want to mention there's an appendix to this report that contains state summary tables that provide a statistical profile for each state. And the tables are related to the key themes of the report. Advocates can consult these tables for information on economic concentration, demographics, and farm practices in their states. And they can then go to the main report for more detail about whatever issue they're interested in. So thank you for your interest in this report, and feel free to email us with any questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bryce and Nate. I know there's some questions in the Q&A, so just a reminder to everyone who is with us, if you have questions, now's a great time to add them in. And I'm gonna, I think, go through and ask some of these, but while we're waiting and to allow people some time to add some other questions in, I'm gonna ask one or two of my own questions. So the first I wanted to ask was actually, was kind of, what was like the most surprising to you? And I know there's like a ton of data, but you know, what was there like one or two things that really surprised you when you really dug into the data and was either not what you expected or like that you think will be really surprising to most to researchers or people like that had one picture of what the landscape looked like of agriculture in the Midwest?
I can go first. I didn't really know about and unfortunately I didn't have time to talk about it in the presentation, but I didn't know the role that Hmong farmers played in the Midwest, who immigrated to Minnesota in the 70s and after, and they're very well represented in farmers markets, and they operate a lot of small farms, and you can see that in the data. That was something I didn't know about, so that was probably the most interesting thing
Very cool.
to me. Yeah.
Mine also had to do with BIPOC farmers. I mean, I did not expect there to be a lot of Black farmers in the region, but I was surprised by how few there actually are. I think there were, I may be wrong about the exact number, but I think there were 82 Black farmers with moderate sales or more in the 6-state region. And even that number, for reasons we could talk about, might be somewhat inflated, and that's shockingly small.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and probably like way less than what most people think. All right, I'm gonna ask you one other before we turn to the rest of the group. I think another one, you sort of, presented a lot of problems with agriculture in the region, both sort of like from an equity perspective, from an environmental perspective. And I guess, I know your report is more giving data that people can use and understand, but do you have thoughts on practical steps that you think advocates can take, whether ways people can use this as resources or just like if people are concerned about these issues, what are some ways to get engaged?
Well, I think that something we tried to convey was how deep the problem is and how rooted it is in the concentration of land ownership and farm ownership, and exactly how hard it is to get property because of the expense. So, I mean, I think we really need a big shift in the farm system to, and then, like, as we talk about in the history, a lot of the land was taken totally unfairly. And even the Black settlements in the 1800s, which is a really interesting part of history, I think they're almost all gone now. And, the people who are still on the farms report discrimination. So I guess, fighting discrimination at USDA is an important part of it. And then another thing that is interesting to me that I learned about was all the problems Native Americans have, which obviously seems extremely unfair. Not only not owning their land, but even when they own their land, sometimes there's restrictions on it, or the reservation can have 5 or 10 different kinds of titles, and it's like impossible to develop. So anyway, those are some issues, I think could be fruitful and people can understand and hopefully organize around.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in some ways, the equity issues are a little more complex than the environmental issues, which, I mean, there's a lot that can and should be done to address the environmental pollution. And it's I co-authored a book with Peter Lehner where we go into great depth about a lot that can be done to address these issues. But there are practices like agroforestry, alley cropping, that are applicable and could, with some relatively minor policy changes, be profitable for conventional agriculture throughout the region and in much of the region, actually, I should say. When it comes to equity, I think it depends on the population we're talking about. The situation for Black farmers is much different than the situation for Hispanic farmers, than for, beginning farmers with no agricultural background or no family ties to agriculture. And so that in some ways is a little more complicated. But I think the one thing, one important step is to, I think part of the policy response has been to give money to newer beginning farmers. And this, whether they're BIPOC or not. And this unfortunately can have the effect of providing funds to people who would have the means to farm regardless. Iowa has a fund for new and beginning farmers, and I'm not sure if they release this report anymore, but the last time I checked the report a few years ago, they had data on the wealth of the new and beginning farmers who participated in this program, and they were overwhelmingly already had a substantial wealth, particularly given their age. And I think that often the people benefiting from these programs already have a foot in agriculture through their families' property and businesses. And this doesn't mean that they shouldn't be working in agriculture, or they shouldn't have these opportunities, but it's not necessarily the target population that we would want to be looking at if we're focused on equity.
Okay, I'm gonna start taking some of the questions that we have, which, first of all, thank you, all of you who are here. I see all your questions coming in, and there's a really great bunch here. So what I'm gonna attempt to do is group a couple of them and ask them to you all, and see where we get. So I think there's a first question. I would say there's a set of questions here that really get to how did you engage with farmers, and kind of are there things you might have missed by really primarily focusing on data? So I'll ask you, a few people ask things does your report address the limitations of data sets, for example, farms that might not be reached by the USDA census, and maybe that is more of a question of what does the census cover. Another one of our questions was about without sort of this ground up view of farms themselves, how can we be sure that it kind of captures the detail of how farms operate? And then I think there was one or two others about just have you really interviewed farmers or contextualize this with farmers? So I'm gonna give you that as a group of questions, which I think is a fair set of questions around why did you choose the method that you did? Are there things that might be missing? What do you think might be the limitations? Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to go, Nathan?
Sure. Yeah. I'll start. Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. And without a doubt, our report, which is very data focused, certainly missed some things. And I think one of the major takeaways from our report is that the USDA data are often misleading and misused. And so the data are imperfect, and that's incredibly important to understand. They're also imperfect in some ways that are comprehensible. And I think it's important to try to understand the ways in which they're imperfect and or ambiguous. And I think when, did we to answer the question of whether or not we supplemented this report with farm interviews, we did not do interviews in this report. But we've been working on similar issues now for more than a decade, and we've done extensive interviews with farmers on related issues, including, when it comes to BIPOC farmers, we did a lot of research prior to the pandemic and interviewed over 100 people for that. And I've also, I live in Michigan currently, and I lived in Iowa previously. And so we have experience in the region and have some of that on the ground experience, as imperfect as it is. So this is all to say that these data it's a data-focused report. These data are imperfect. But one of the, I think, major takeaways for people working on these issues is that focusing on, and this is something, this is my own personal experience. When I started working on agricultural issues and working with BIPOC farmers and people who are trying to find alternative means of production and marketing, these farmers exist, and these farmers are important to learn from and to connect with. At the same time, for people, and I include myself in this, who work with these farmers, it can be very easy for us to overstate their impact. And I think if we want to change the food system, if we want to change the agricultural system, it's important for us to understand how large these populations are and what sort of effects they're having. And I think often their size is, using the census data, is overstated in a way that can create overly optimistic accounts of what's happening, which makes real progress more difficult. So I think having understanding the data and combining it with on the ground knowledge is very important in terms of understanding the real what's really happening on the ground. And I'll give you an example. Bryce and I, this was not in the Midwest, but we visited a Black farming advocate in North Carolina, along with two Black farming advocates in North Carolina, in a county that the census said, Bryce, do you remember the specific number? I think there were a dozen.
50 to 70 or something.
Yeah, 50 to 70 Black farmers. And when we asked them if that accorded with their experience, they just laughed, and because they knew that number was ridiculous. And there weren't more than a handful of Black farmers in the whole county.
Yeah, we found that, pretty much every Black farmer we interviewed, no matter where they were in the country, we'd always say, USDA says there's this many farmers in your county. Do you think that's right? And they would always say, no, it's way too high. So there are a lot of problems with the census. And we've spent a long time looking at it. And I know there's people who aren't reached. I mean, they didn't reach Black farmers for a long time, and I'm sure they're still not reaching some, but there's a lot to parse out. I mean, census isn't a count the way it's reported. It's estimated. And it's especially estimated for smaller groups because they don't reach them as easily. So there's a lot of error. There's a lot of statistical error, which USDA doesn't really mention, but it's actually an estimate, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And so we tried to, correct for that. But with the farms above the threshold, we use 150,000. They don't miss a lot of them. I mean, it depends how much you trust
Yeah.
what they're saying. They do coverage analyses. There's problems with every survey. But according to them, they don't miss very many of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I think it makes a lot of sense. And, I know for those joining us, the report, which is linked in the chat, as well as the summary tables. I mean, there's already a lot there. I think, there's certainly like opportunities, and maybe it's a good follow-up is like sharing more with some of the farmer groups. I think our goal in doing this is making some of this available, but you're already covering a lot of territory. So it couldn't, I think it has a really important purpose. Okay, I'm gonna ask you a couple other like bunches of questions. So we have a whole bunch of questions, and this was my question too, and I hesitate to ask, but was about, do you see yourself really updating this report with the new USDA data? A couple other people asked about like, well, 2017 felt like a generation ago because of the pandemic, and so I know you're probably thinking, I don't even want to think about that right now, but I'm curious like what your thoughts are on, is there a good opportunity here to see how things change over time? And is that something on your radar? And yeah.
yeah, at some point.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I get it. The 22 results, they just came out. Obviously, they came out. Well, they can't, maybe not obviously, but they came out after the report came out. So we didn't have time to look at them. And every census, yeah, having looked at them now for years, like they all have their own problems that you kind of have to get a handle on before you can really start talking about the results with certainty. But yeah, at some point, yeah,
One day.
would like to do that.
Between that and the next census 5 years after.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would add a quick note that I can't speak for everything in the 2022 census. But it seems like the kind of trends that we cover in the report either continued or in fact were exacerbated in between the two censuses. So, nationally there are fewer Black farmers, and that is almost certainly true in this region. I think, as someone noted in the Q&A, land and market access is becoming more difficult. But yeah, it would be great to be able to dive into the 2022 census in the same way.
Yeah, and we try to establish some of these patterns in our work of like the increasing concentration and explain why. And we know that the factors have gotten worse, like the government payments continuing or possibly even being worse in their concentration to larger farms, or land becoming more expensive, and so on and so forth. So we would expect, without necessarily looking at the data so much, that these trends would continue. But of course, we would like to get into it in detail at some point.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so now I'm gonna dive in. There's like a few on like some of the specific things you talked about. So one here is about you talked about, for animal farming, it's dominated by CAFO systems, which isn't surprising. Can you talk a little bit about how many of these are family CAFO farms, or ones where the animals are owned and and conditions dictated by corporations? I don't know if you have anything on that, but also the other part of the question was, do you know the percentage of animal farms who are not using that kind of model? So I guess more like how deep does the data go on like some of the animal production side of what you saw?
Yeah, those are good questions. So the family farm issue, the report doesn't get too much into it. We do have a few pages on it. I have, because of some correspondence, I have looked into it a little more, and there certainly is corporate ownership of CAFOs. And the bigger the farm, the more likely it is to be owned by a corporation. As I remember it, but don't quote me on it, the families still own the vast majority of the largest farms. And the largest animal farms. And yeah, there probably is some variation by the specialty as well. But I can't give you a number on it, but you could email me and I could try to look up a number. But and then I forget, was part of that asking if there's non-CAFO?
Yeah, like do you know the percentage of animal producers that don't use a CAFO system in the region?
I don't know, but I know, I mean, again, it's something I could look at, but I do know, like with cattle ranchers, it's not as CAFOized, I guess you could say. There's a lot more smaller producers before the feedlot stage. And there are still dairy farms that are not exactly CAFOs, I guess. They don't exactly have giant warehouses filled with cows. But that model is kind of going out because it's not as profitable as the big model. So that's probably the way of the future, unfortunately, unless the government steps in or people step in somehow.
And I think that also highlights one of the weaknesses of USDA's data, and that when it comes to sustainable practices, it's often very weak in terms of what it tells us. So the USDA data, whether it's ARMS or the census data, will tell us how many animals approximately are on a given farm, but it won't tell us what sort of what living conditions they have, how much access they have to the degree to which they're pastured, etc. So a lot of the nuances can be lost in the data because you could have a relatively small animal facility that still is industrial in terms of the production.
So another kind of data question. There's a couple on I think Nate, what you were talking about around the $1,000 threshold and the no sales. So I'll give you these two questions. One was just can you talk more about how USDA determined that $1,000 threshold, and that you think it should be updated for inflation to be 5,000? Are there I think this question says, are there other factors that should be considered in updating that threshold? And then there was sort of somewhat related question around, does no sales mean no donations also, which I don't know what that's getting at exactly, but could there be farms that are producing over a certain amount and are doing something with them that aren't sales?
Yeah, so quick, so in terms of the $5,000 threshold, we're not necessarily advocating for adjusting the threshold. I do think that the USDA should distinguish between, farms that are trying to make money and those that are not trying to make money. Whether those other farms are hobby farms, lifestyle farms, educational farms, are growing food to donate to our food bank farms, etc. I think it's important to know their purpose and distinguish them from farms that are actually trying to make money, because there are a lot of new beginning BIPOC farmers that are trying to make a living from farming, and current farms. And to be able to evaluate that, we have to distinguish between these different types. So it's not necessarily about excluding some farms, although many farms in the census, to be clear, are not even farms according to their owners. But some of them are. And we don't necessarily need to exclude them just because they donate their food or it's an educational farm. But the census easily could have questions that get at that. In terms of how the threshold was decided I don't remember if it was decided in the 1974. I think that was just the last year that it was adjusted for inflation. I Bryce might be more familiar with the debate at the time. I think it's always been somewhat contentious. I think going back 50 years ago, there were a lot more people who farmed for a small amount of money, or were, we would call subsistence farmers in the United States.
Mhm.
There were very poor people who farmed to make a little more money or to feed their families in a way that is much, much less common now. And so there were various attempts at that time to distinguish between what we now call commercial farms that were capital intensive and engaged in marketing their products to and made excess income from that, and these kind of smaller farms. But the situation is completely different now. And rather than smaller subsistence farms, most of these farms that are or would be below the threshold are owned by wealthy people who are not trying to make money. And then to answer the last question about donations, I don't know. I was involved in working with farms and food banks in New York about 10 years ago now. And so I can say, at least in New York State at that time, there were very few, there were one or two farms, primarily educational farms, or that were operated by food banks that just produced farms for donations. But in terms of the overall scale of these no-sale farms, it's a very small number. And one of the ways we know that is not just from my experience in New York State, but also that the number of no-sale farms is directly attributed to USDA's methodology. And in the 1980s, there was a very small number of no-sales farms in the census. And then the number shot up in part because USDA started counting farms that had the potential to produce $1,000 worth, right? And so the farms that are donating money, they don't just have that potential to produce $1,000 worth. They're producing $1,000 worth. And in the 90s, USDA started counting farms that had the potential to, and that dramatically increased the number of no sales farms.
Mhm.
And I mean, they actually even count government payments toward the threshold. So you can even get a conservation payment and make it over the threshold. And I think they may even have the data to kind of try to untangle who's getting over it just because of the payments. And I don't think it's a small number.
Mhm.
And yeah, well, just to be quick, if anyone wants to look, the 1974 census has a discussion of the threshold in the introduction, why they did it, the different things they considered, like acreage or number of animals and stuff. And USDA has a lot of papers where they try to develop typologies of different kinds of farms, because they seem aware that I think they are aware that they're counting a lot of properties that aren't farms. And they use different things like whether the operator works on the farm or not. So anyway, a lot of those are very interesting to check out if you want to look into it. And then they do publish a typology report, which is very helpful. And I think what Nate and I would like to see from USDA is making this clearer to people, breaking out the data routinely and not in an appendix typology report. Because it does, we know the black farmer situation probably the best, that it really gives people a totally wrong impression that doesn't accord with what black farmers say. So anyway, yeah, we're not necessarily saying raise the threshold, but just clarify what are you publishing here? Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. I know we're getting close to time. There's so many good kind of comments in here that I think we'll, be able to share with the speakers offline. Maybe I'll ask you two other really quick ones and then we'll close out. But I guess one year was about, it said, wasn't 2017 when the census questions were changed to increase the number of women farmers. What did you find in regards to women farmers in the Midwest?
Great question. We did not have the scope to look at women farmers. In the report, we explained why we didn't look at gender. We wanted to, but it's another complicated thing that we've looked a little bit into, but there are a lot of issues with the counts of women farmers, that some of which are similar to the counts for BIPOC farmers, where I think the vast majority, I think the last time I looked, maybe it was for 2017, maybe 2012, but the vast majority of women farmers were on these very small farms, and like a lot of them were the farm. Another helpful thing to look at is what the farm specializes in. A lot of them specialized in horses, was like a really common one for women farmers. And then sometimes, yeah, I don't know. So it's just hard to, and it's hard with the changes in the methodology to understand what's happening historically. But we definitely would very much like to look at it. Unfortunately, we weren't able to look at it in this report.
Yeah, I would just add to that, we were very interested in, and we, as Bryce said, we eventually decided not to look at it because it's a very complicated issue, which we hope to be able to look at more in this region and elsewhere. But I will say very quickly that the USDA, if you look at the number of female farmers with moderate sales or more, it's a lot less impressive than the figures for female farmers overall. Just like it's a similar phenomenon as with BIPOC farmers, in that the number of low or no sales farmers that are the share of low or no sales farmers that are female farmers is much higher than the share of moderate sales or more. So what this tells us is that a lot of the female farmers are not participating in the business economy of agriculture.
All right, I'm gonna give you one quick lightning question, which just came in, which I think is a good closing one, which is just, if you can, what's the response you've gotten as far as like the media, the ag industry, or any like outreach you've gotten in light of the report since it's come out so far? Or not much?
Mostly heard from other researchers.
Okay.
I guess they like the report. I don't know.
Okay. Well, we're hoping, that's part of this, is getting the word out. So that's a good maybe point to close on. First, let me just say there were a really great questions that people shared here. And I know I appreciate like all the thought, and there's some other good resources in there too. So we'll make sure that we're able to share that. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today, and most of all, Nate and Bryce, for the time that went into this amazing report and taking the time today to talk about it. And this webinar also is being recorded, so we'll also have a recording of this on our website along with the reports themselves. And thank you also for making yourselves available and sharing your emails for follow-up questions. And if anyone had a question today that didn't get answered, I encourage you to reach out to Bryce and Nate as well. So I think with that, I will bring us to the conclusion of our time. And thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Bye.